Thank you for that. So the title of my talk today is Bezos to Bottlenecks, the Chasm Between Altruism, or the Promise of Altruism, and the Amerindigenous. My name is Joseph Yracheta. I am native to Mexico. I come from the Purepecha and the Raramuri people from the state of Michoacan and the state of Chihuahua. For those who don't know where those places are, Michoacan is west central Mexico. Chihuahua is the state just below New Mexico in the United States. My wife and kids are enrolled members of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe here in South Dakota. This is a little bit about my educational background and some pictures of me for those who can't see me right now over their camera. But I graduated from the Loyola Chicago. Then I was a short time a student and a long time a biotechnician at UW-Madison. Then I got my master's degree late in life from the UW-Seattle in pharmacogenomics, and I'm currently at Johns-Hopkins finishing up a degree in environmental health and engineering, and I am also the executive director of the Native Biodata Consortium, which I'll talk about later. So some of my talk today will sound a little bit preachy, and I hope you guys don't mind. It's said with the best intention. But if those of you who don't know, Oppenheimer and Einstein, after the use of the atomic bomb in Japan, went on the lecture circuit and started to talk about the responsibility of science and scientists. And I think that for the most part, since the 1950s, science and the scientific community has moved away from these warnings that Oppenheimer and Einstein gave us, and we've also moved away from our origins of philosophy. So science began as general philosophy, then all of the different philosophies broke up into subsections or sub parts of philosophy, and science was born from that. And here in this this slide, Oppenheimer says, even the best of us knows how to do only a very few things well, and what is available in the knowledge of fact, whether the science of science or history, only the smallest parts is in any one man's knowing. And I think that we need to remember these facts in this current era. Also, Jacob Bronowski, who became kind of a famous TV scientist in England, who was also a Czechoslovakian Jew that moved to Great Britain during World War II. He was famous for saying, "No science is immune to the infection of politics or the corruption of power." And here in the United States, Louis Brandeis said, "Publicity is just commended as a remedy for social and industrial diseases. Sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants, electric light the most efficient policeman." And so that's kind of the theme of my talk today, is in this big data era, who is policing the people controlling and producing this big data? So back in the day, they said science is a rich man's pursuit because it was definitely in the purview of the wealthy, not only because they had the access to education, but because in order to have a life as a scientist, you did not make a lot of money. There's a lot of failures, there's a lot of disappointments, and really not a big salary. So my question for you all today is, there are more non-white or non-wealthy scientists in the sciences. Does that, in addition to these other things that are listed here, create more accountability for scientists? Should scientists change, or should scientists sort of stay as these purists? They're almost artists in their endeavor of pursuing the truth. Some of these things, like disruptive technologies that created the big data era, these ideas about democratizing science might not be good for science overall. Global corporations controlling a lot of the products from science, growing partisanship across the world, growing monopolies that are often camouflaged by breaking up different companies into small subsections of companies, growing disparity, not only between economic and health disparity, but also in disparity of power, sharp decrease in privacy of ethics. We all have heard the stories from social media, how especially the generation, say, below 30 years old, don't really have that much concern with privacy anymore because everything's not private on the internet. And then now that we realize that so much power rests with scientists and technicians in creating these technologies and collecting this data, has it translated into more scientists as political leaders owning corporations with a moral or ethical standard? And are any of these scientists on policy or legal committees? This is especially true for people like myself. Latin America still in many ways is living in the 1800s. There's very much a racial caste system. Similarly, India is in that same boat where admixture, 50-50 indigenous populations with some European colonizer really pits our own people against the indigenous of the same country. So any of you in the audience today who might be still living in a colonial government or have transitioned to an independent government that's still wrestling with some of the holdovers from colonialism, this is very, very important in the big data era. So these are the general reasons why we should share and have an open access to data. And I'm a scientist, I believe in that. But we do live in this reality where we're divided between the research and data collection process and then the data development and product process. And we have to attend to those things. So altruistic duty, yep, that's a good one. Fairness of the commons, yes, it's paid for by public tax dollars. We're all human, we should all benefit. Size relations, there's so much data out there and we only have a limited number of eyeballs and expertise to look at that. The cost of healthcare and data storage were and are increasing. Research, at least public research dollars, are going down. Efficiency, less duplication of sample and data collection, and there's this push to centralized databases, curated and harmonized. And then the one is, in terms of solutions, discovery and innovation. And the only problem I have there is that for a lot of European and European descendant type studies, all of the fruit is at the top of the tree. But for minority populations and indigenous populations, a lot of that fruit is low-hanging fruit, and it's probably even lower for us that are from the community, and we should benefit from that data, not only in terms of implementation, but in terms of making careers and generating economy from that low-hanging fruit. So again, this is sort of a repeat. On the right, you see all of the good reasons for open data sharing. However, reality dictates that tribes especially need to build capacity and capability. They need to fortify legal and policy protections so that they can leverage data and science for economic leverage and growth, and they can't do any of this unless they have the technology and infrastructure, which they don't have. If they don't have that, they will not have empowerment or protection for their data, and they will not have any assured return of benefit from data. So data sharing in this environment is questionable. So data is not king. Lots of people think that data is king. Actually, context is king. And so when people try to make science as objective or agnostic, that is not true because of the previously stated reasons. Disruptive technologies are allowing us to do many of these things. And for those of you who don't know the definition, the disruptive technologies often increase the capability and decrease costs. They cause convergence and crossover of technologies that weren't possible prior to their existence. Just look at your cell phone, for instance. They cause complete obsolescence of previous technologies, and they become rapidly opaque, meaning they sink into the background. And with that sinking into the background, so does the regulation and the monitoring of those technologies. So here in the US, for public research dollars, The Common Rule or the Belmont Report basically monitor and provide guidelines for data collection, but they have not kept up with the power of these disruptive technologies. Basically, the ethics in the Common Rule had not predicted the things that we can do now with data. Data is promiscuous, it is ubiquitous, and can be transferred into another legal jurisdiction with the strike of a laptop key. Here's a particular example which tribes would not agree with. Tribes would not agree that this answer is incorrect. Here it says the correct answer is that data can be shared for another project if the biospecimens are de-identified because the research is no longer considered human subjects research because it's not primary, it's secondary data. However, lots of people, white and non-white, consider it ethically problematic to use specimens in a manner that is not inconsistent with the language of informed consent. Further, lots of non-white populations have some unique genetic histories that are very sought after by large corporations, and they won't necessarily be beneficiaries from any of the monetary gains from these technologies or these investigations. Here recently with COVID, lots of people have been writing about how different regulatory systems were never meant to interact and are somehow magically interacting under COVID. There's HIPAA restrictions, there's public health law, and there's the Common Rule, and they're kind of all getting mixed up with the FDA and clinical trials. Then there's this older issue, if you don't know. All of these samples collected, before 1980 didn't have the same sort of regulation that exists now for consent and group protections. And so all of these samples that are out there sitting in somebody's freezer are finding new life, not only because of the disruptive technology, but because there isn't any real regulation, or there wasn't any regulation back when they were collected. And so some of those samples belong to underrepresented or vulnerable populations like Indigenous people. And the other larger context is that in the Americas, there is always been this back and forth on whether or not Indigenous people are property of their settler colonial states, or they are independent of those settler colonial states. And in the beginning, at least in the US, they wanted them segregated. They wanted them away from white populations, and both sides, tribes and the US government, treated to keep them separate. And then slowly they started forcing them into assimilation. Right now you're seeing that with the bodies that they're finding up in Canada at the boarding schools, and they're starting to find them here in the US. But in the 70s, Indigenous people themselves came to the fore, and they decided to help draft some new legislation for self-determination and self-sustainability. We are now back in the other side of the pendulum, where the United States is considering them bioproperty for the purposes of genomics, and not really attending to the laws that already exist for tribal consultation and tribal ownership of their own data. And here's just an example, a recent example, where large corporations and their lawyers are picking at the edges of tribal sovereignty by attacking small laws like the Indian Child Welfare Act, which says that children from tribes need to be placed with Indian families. They're trying to pick at this law and get rid of it, because then they can go to the next law and to the next law until they finally get to the resources that they want, which might be land or mineral resources, or they could be biological resources. But it's funny that these corporations and these lawyers are basically re-narrating this, saying that the tribes are tyrannical over the progress of science and economic development, which is, to me, laughable. We have, of course, these principles about fair. Again, as a scientist, I believe in this, but I don't think that we're necessarily, as a society, ready for these concepts until we fix the other side of the equation, which is intervention, implementation, and product development. Here, we have all these recent arguments here in the United States about socialism and capitalism. Neither one really attends to indigenous issues because they see us as property or belonging to the greater nation. But both of them want to come to us and say, look, we understand things weren't fair. Let's start over. To be fair, let's start being fair right now without addressing any of the current problems or problems of the past. And don't worry about it. Just trust us, it'll work out if we just stick to the plan. That has never worked for us, and it's not going to work for us. So those kinds of ideas of socialism or capitalism can't go forward without giving tribes the ability to control their own information. Just a few more examples. I'll go through these quickly. So in the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the tribes here in the Northern Plains were given the Black Hills, but once gold was found and they couldn't stop white citizens from going in there illegally, they basically gave the tribes an option. They better sell it or starve. The tribes never sold that land. It's still in dispute. It's worth $74 billion. They've been offered $1.4 billion. None of them have taken it yet. Same thing with the Dawes Act, which basically subdivided lots of Indian territory into tax-based lots. Turned out that it wasn't very well managed by the US government and resulted in the seizure of a lot of Indian land. And this case was brought to court by Cobell and Salazar, and they won $3.4 billion out of $176 billion probably owed. But they settled out of court for $3.4 billion. The kicker of this is that a lot of this money is not, a lot of it went to legal costs, and a lot of it is not within the control of the tribes. They can live off the principal as interest, but they cannot control the money directly. And that's what happens with a lot of these things that the United States owes Indian people, is they admit they did something wrong, but they still control the issue so much that it really doesn't benefit Indian people. And then, as many of you know, the world is fed dry, canned, and packaged good 80% American products. So 13 of the top most valuable crops are from here. Both by tonnage and economics, and some of them are corn, potatoes, cassava, tomatoes, peanuts, guavas, cotton, chocolate, beans, rubber, sunflower, turkeys, and believe it or not, strawberries. And if you add tobacco in that, that's another $600 billion a year, and most of it's grown in Southeast Asia or Africa, and not one Native American government is benefiting from these things. Most recently, Taxol, which was developed with the knowledge of Indigenous people from the Pacific Northwest, both in Canada and the United States. They not only cut down many of the trees in pursuit of this particular drug, but they didn't give, there was any profit or benefit sharing from this drug for any Indigenous people. This is a very expensive drug for cancer, and it's not being made available to Native people for a reduced cost. And sometimes people like to pretend that Native American medicines are not worth anything, but of course we have examples of curare and quinine, where tribes didn't get any money for that. But recently, China has brought a lot of their herbal medicines to market, especially this famous case for malaria. So it's no question or secret that data is the next big world issue. It is also the next big tribal issue. Data is being collected through public means and is likely to be collected now with these large projects for machine learning and AI, where again, you will not have to ask a tribal group for their data because it's all public. And Google, Facebook, and Microsoft have all invested heavily in the biomedical industry and are doing a lot of their research on their own. So they're outside a lot of these regulatory systems that I had mentioned earlier. And the digital genome market is going to be worth $50 billion in 2025 as predicted. So we feel that tribes need to be aware of this and also have a path to benefit. So generally, the world is suffering under this weight of ownership. However, just as always, people in the lower ranks of society can't compete on this level, and it's these larger, previously existing wealthier corporations that are basically scooping up all of the data and all of the possible intellectual property they can. And Shoshana Zuboff from Harvard mentions this in her book of Surveillance Capitalism. These large corporations are definitely international and going around the world and creating patent plantations and changing legislations in countries where patents are not favorable to them, so that they can take this data right now, not worth anything, but it might be worth something in the future, so that they can basically corner the market. And that's happening in Canada, where Canada has a nationalized healthcare system, and the provinces are controlling that data, not the federal government of Canada. And a lot of American companies are going up there on purpose to try and break up that system so they can get at that data. In terms of Native people, we have a right to our own resources, including these new resources generated by disruptive technologies, but they're not being recognized. Some of them are the normal stuff that you've heard about, cultural and spiritual things like songs and ceremonies. This is an example of a song that was taken away from an indigenous group in Mexico. This was a T-Rex that was found here on Cheyenne River that ended up not going to Cheyenne River, so the tribe couldn't control this particular find. And then lots of authority over cultural and botanical resources that tribes are creating laws, but again, not recognized. And it's been followed up by lawsuits. The most famous one is No Dapple, with the pipeline running just outside the jurisdiction of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, which was kind of a ironic and shameful way to do business. Juul, the artificial cigarette company, has been caught and also settled out of court with some tribes in terms of marketing this as a smoking cessation tool, when really they were just trying to market to impoverished population that would be amenable to this kind of marketing. Of course, we all know about the modification of corn, which never was discussed or consulted with by any kind of Native group. And then back to the issue of children. There have been many states that have been sued and adjudicated against for taking Indian children away, but really the problem continues, even though these things have happened over and over again and been transparent to the public. Of course, drones and satellites are something that's happening in American Indian reservations without their permission. And that's something a lot of tribal groups don't realize, that data is being collected that way. And the whole point of this is, if we don't tackle some of these basic issues, nothing is going to change. What everybody says is going to happen is the diagram on the left, but likely because of all these pre-existing problems, what's going to happen is what we see here on the right. And it's basically that technology is outpacing government regulation for, things like Uber, drones, driverless cars, all kinds of technologies. And the government is basically trying to desperately hang on to this relationship with business, because business does not have to do things by consensus, does not have to or argue in Congress. They don't have to do anything that would follow any sort of fair or just distribution of resources. They can do whatever they want. And so the government is bending over backwards for these corporations. Bayh-Dole Act was one of the laws that started in 1980 to take this publicly funded data and move it over into the private space, mostly through universities as a stakeholder, but didn't recognize tribes as a competing stakeholder. And this was worsened in 2007 through 2015 with the America Competes Act, which is kind of, in my opinion anyway, reduced academic integrity across the board for many scientific disciplines, because you have to apply for grants not only with pilot data, but you also have to have some commercially applicable goal in mind before you can get some money. Another thing is that many Western countries changed from first to develop to first to file patent law, which allows them to do this basically monopoly of data. So you can have a barely inkling of an idea, patent it, and then hope that somebody buys your idea later on. And then this promise of altruism to help underrepresented minorities or Native people is always comes with the ask of giving us more data, whatever that data is. And so the first step is to collect data and analyze that data. The promise is step 3, development, funding, intervention, implementation, and health improvement. But nobody is working on step 2. Nobody is connecting that divide between us as scientists and those people who are developing products and intervention. There is no work done on how that magic is going to happen. We kind of rely on the market force model, but that market force has been shown over and over again not to help poor people. I'm going to skip over this. So there is somewhat of a mispromise of genomics, especially individualized. It's far away. If the public charge is to use public tax dollars, then we should be focusing on larger public issues, such as precision public health, modifying vaccines, modifying micronutrient recommendations, modifying dietary recommendations, modifying a lot of things in public health that haven't been tailored to non-white populations. And in terms of Indigenous people, we make up very small populations of the countries we're in. Here in the United States, it's less than 5%. In the Canada, it's less than 2%. And even though there are a lot of Indigenous people in Latin America, they're not recognized anyway. But they're basically manipulated by the bait and hook of these large diseases that likely don't have a genetic basis. Their basis is socioeconomic, and they're shared across humanity. They're not just for Indigenous people. And a lot of our conditions kind of fall in that long tail of rare diseases, mostly because we're such a small population. And the market, whether that's the public funds or private funds, our conditions are not of interest to the market. Our conditions do not have a lot of data. There's a little bit of data, but nobody ever follows up on that data. The funding from the public sources do not prioritize social determinants of health or the exposome. They always jump directly to the genome because that's where you can develop products. Also, if there are some findings and there are some pharmacogenomic solutions, there are likely no companies that are going to develop these into products because the populations can't pay and they're small. In addition, this is what happens with a lot of research or researchers. They don't have much business sense. They don't have any political sense. Sometimes they don't have any ethical sense. And so they collect the data and they don't follow through with all of the research that they should. They don't partner in a transdisciplinary way with other researchers so that all of these things can happen. What usually happens is the first 3 happen, and then steps 4 through 7, basically they tell tribes, well, you're sovereign, you need to take care of those other steps by yourself. So the researchers and the universities get data, they take it and do what they want with it, develop it into a product, and then tribes are stuck with the data they don't know how to use or implement and can't capitalize or benefit from it. So some of this has been addressed by the Nagoya Protocol to protect that data, but problems with the Nagoya Protocol is that large Western countries have not signed on to it, including Canada and the United States. Also, human genomes were taken off the table completely, and other genomes from other animals, plants, and microbiota were taken off the table if they were already previously described. So there's no way to go back and protect chocolate, for instance, or protect quinine or any of those kinds of things. There's no way to go backwards. And the reason is so that these companies in third world countries and indigenous populations can actually benefit from their own genomic resources and traditional knowledge and data resources. However, in Canada, they're moving a little bit faster, so is New Zealand. This academic researcher, Janice Geary, helped some Inuit from northern Manitoba to create the first intellectual property contract for H. pylori, so that if something does develop monetarily from this research, they will benefit directly. Canada has done a lot of different things in the research area and created their own research department for Indigenous people so that the Indigenous people will have more say-so over their own data. However, the Nagoya Protocol in general is being attacked on several different bases. They're being attacked in synthetic biology corners. They're being attacked right now for COVID, saying that somehow the Nagoya Protocol is preventing COVID response, which isn't true. And they're being attacked just on moral and ethical grounds that we have a common human heritage and that we should all be sharing these resources. So in general, Native participation across the Americas is low. There were 3 cases early in the 2000s from British Columbia, Brazil, and Arizona, where tribes felt that their samples were being used unjustly. They got their samples back, but the data is still out there for many people to see. I've been part of some of these papers. This paper is international with New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Mexico, and the United States represented of what the rights and interests of Indigenous people have to their own data. And I was part of this in the past in 2011 when tribes from the Pacific Northwest met with NIH to talk about these issues. And the tribes were emphatic that they said that this doesn't matter who's paying for it, the data belongs to them. It's not solved. Recently, with the All of Us project, they tried to do consultation. They tried to do it in a hurried fashion. They tried to do it with the National Congress of American Indians, which is inappropriate. They should approach every single 578 plus tribe, and they didn't do it that way. And so the National Congress of American Indians basically wrote this cease and desist order saying that the All of Us program needs to do things better before tribes will consent to giving over their data. So we created the Biorepository for American Indian Capacity Education and Law, Economy and Technology with the help of Stanford. And it has turned into the Native Biodata Consortium, which is the first 501c3 nonprofit housed within the geographic borders of an Indian nation and the legal jurisdiction of an Indian nation. And we're hoping that that helps solve a lot of these problems. And this is basically repeating what I said, why U.S. tribes do not want to participate. There's lots of past research harms. There's policies that do not favor the tribes. We want to improve data sovereignty and data governance. We also are insisting that tribes have more oversight over us. We want to build capacity through STEM education and promote health equity, and then use our own local expertise to reduce population stratification issues, which we know because we live here. And we have a almost all Indigenous executive board. Only one member is not Native. Our community advisory group board are all from here. They're all from Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation. And we want to collect other data because there's not a lot of longitudinal data for tribes. So we want to try and repatriate data from museums, environmental data, any past legacy samples. We want to get that data because it's necessary for longitudinal investigations. We also want to build training sessions, training centers for our own high school and college people, also training centers for outside researchers and federal funding agencies to know how to work with tribes, and then with tribal leaderships and businesses, how to capitalize and protect themselves in this big data era. And then we also want to create a commercial entity that would exist side by side with the nonprofit, so we can take in non-native samples and data from other places, whether that's cord blood, pharmaceutical data, whatever needs to be protected by an air gap network, we can do. We have 65 miles in any direction of land that protects us, and then we also have the tribe's legal jurisdiction. So in general, we want to try and bridge those problems with the Nagoya Protocol by using tribal jurisdiction to ratify and accept its premises here on the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation. We want to do all the things I just said, mostly be a safe haven for any depositors. We don't even necessarily have to use the data. We just want to be a safe harbor. These are some of the reasons. These are just the things I could come up with right away. 25 different types of things that would impact health and healthcare in tribal communities that are not being looked at. But however, people are looking for our data for other reasons. We are an isolated population. We've been here by ourselves for 20 to 40,000 years. We had at least 5 bottlenecks. The most recent one was when Europeans arrived. We have a unique hemispheric-wide pattern of gender-biased admixture where it's a Native American female with a European or African male. We have many instances of severe genetic drift that's identified by FST scores, but those FST scores are different qualitatively and quantitatively from FST scores you find in other populations because of our unique genome. There might be a third ancient hominid somewhere lurking in our background. There's reduced genomic diversity that's very important for the genomic endeavor in general. There's all kinds of questions about epistasis and epigenetics that they can learn from our data, and then local adaptation. And so that's kind of a misnomer because it's hemispheric wide. Many people across the Americas share the same local adaptation, but it doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. So we're being sought after for these gifts, but we're not going to get anything for these gifts. I think I'm going to kind of skip a lot of this because I'm running out of time. But basically, this section showed that the things that are supposed to happen in ethics have not been done. Researchers should work with tribes to establish a tribal research department or approach the tribal research department directly if it exists. They should involve the community with all research initiation, community level tools for regulation should be developed or followed. Culturally adapted protocols for research should be developed or adhered to. Community training and capacity building is something that has to happen. Employment of community members should happen. Community involvement and analysis, data sharing and dissemination should happen. Definitely community control and ownership. And education before approval is sought, and then during the consent for each participant. What they found in some of these papers that only the 4, 5, and 6 were being done. Most of the other research protocols done in Indian country were not done. And the other 5 categories were mentioned less than 30% in these projects. And no education was done before approval was given. Again, back to this slide, the Native Biodata Consortium will tailor the Nagoya Protocol for North American populations by creating multifaceted research programs, insist on transdisciplinarity in the teams that approach Native populations, build capacity and long-term partnerships, and ask those researchers to educate themselves on the ethics and the politics of doing research in Indian country and become advocates for us. Again, with the FAIR principles, we will add the CARE principles, which is collective benefit to tribes, the authority of tribes to control their own data, responsibility of outside researchers to the tribe, and tailor-made ethics for tribal communities. We want to go another step further and use the Canadian OCAP, which stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession. Ownership means that a community owns the data in the same way that an individual owns their data when they consent to a project. Control means that they are part of the whole research process and control every aspect of it. Access means that Indigenous people should have access to information collected outside their jurisdiction and control that as well. And then possession. So possession and ownership are not the same. Lots of data and samples are possessed outside the reservation. Tribes want to get those samples and data back into their own possession because it's easier to manage that way. And we're working with a group that is now kind of spread out over the country, but started at the University of Arizona, the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, and there's also a international Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network that we partner with in Australia and New Zealand and Canada. And I just want to remind everybody that in the Americas, it was a vast bounty for non-Indigenous people. And we don't control any of this stuff, not ceremony, not gold and oil, not sunflowers, pineapples, cotton, not data, not our children, not our cultural and artistic artifacts. And we want to, with your help, try to reverse this trend and build a better future for everybody. My acknowledgements are the Center for Ethical Indigenous and Genomic Research from the University of Oklahoma, a diversity supplement that I got through working with Johns-Hopkins, my advisory committee at Johns-Hopkins, the Native Biodata Consortium here on Cheyenne River, and the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribal Council and Health Committee. And with that, I'm finished.
All right, Joe, that was really interesting. I have a couple of questions for you, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I want to start off with a sort of more technical one. So you said several things that surprised me along the way, but one of them was you talked about reduced genomic diversity in indigenous populations. And I'm a little bit surprised by that because, I think most genomic diversity arises just from time to last common ancestor. And because indigenous populations separated from other human populations longer ago than the European path, I would have thought there would be more genomic diversity. Can you explain that to me a little bit?
Yeah, so I think everybody would agree that most of the genomic diversity is in Africa. And then any population that has left Africa necessarily, by definition, has less genomic diversity just because of time and because of local environmental adaptation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the diversity that you're talking about does happen, but a lot of it is neutral variation. It doesn't have a purpose, and because the estimates of when Columbus arrived here range from 50 million to 250 million people, right? So those 250 million people are thought to have derived from between 70 and 300 ancestors that came from northeast Siberia into the Americas. And then, because the Beringian pause or hypothesis, they got stuck there, they went under more differentiation from the rest of the world and then moved down into the Americas, either by boat or by land, some way. And that population explosion comes with a lot of new variants. Some of them are adapting to local diversity. Some of them are driven by cultural forces like polyamory or polyandry or monogamy, and some of them are mostly neutral. Just the expanse of having a rapidly expanding population where there's no competition, you get all of this brand new variation. And so that's what I was talking about with those FST scores. Carlos Bustamante did a paper and he found that the western part of Mexico was way different than the eastern part of Mexico, to the same degree that Europeans are different from East Asians. But it's in terms of functional adaptations or functional parts of the genome, there's very consistent evidence between Canada and South America. The stuff that's functional is shared by that large geography. The stuff that differs is mostly neutral and not doing anything.
Well, that's true for genomic diversity generally, right? I mean, most genomic diversity is neutral, at least in many circumstances, right? Sometimes it becomes adaptive or maladaptive because the environment changes. But
in terms of being able to survive an environment, you have the extremes of Africa and the Americas, and then everybody else is in between.
Okay. All right, pivoting a little bit. You mentioned a couple of times the importance of building capacity in tribes, and by which I imagine you mean scientific and technical capacity, but possibly also other things. And I wanted to know what you thought had been effective so far in doing that. And it could be multiple things in different places, but, I think capacity building is critical. Here in Hawaii, there's a controversy about a telescope on the top of Mauna Kea, which is a sacred mountain to indigenous folks. And one of the places where I think there's a gap in trying to resolve that intractable problem that's been going on for a long time now is there are very few indigenous astronomers. And so if there were more capacity in that community, there might be a path out somewhere where everybody could get what they needed. And I think that that is generally true, where there's conflict between science and indigenous communities. If there were more indigenous scientists, there would probably be less conflict. And so I was curious about your thoughts on how to build that capacity.
Well, your first question was what have been successful, and I want to say nothing. Nothing's been successful. And it's partly because of the power issues that I described earlier. The people who are funding this and the people who are doing the educating are not from our communities, and they often sidestep or avoid these delicate political and legal questions. They don't want to get into them at all. And so a lot of times they either train people who end up being yes men, that basically further the colonial project and disempower Native people, or they just don't get enough applicants. And that's one of the biggest excuses that these programs rely on or fall back on, is like, we have this money and we have these courses, but we just don't have any applicants. You don't have any applicants because you haven't made it desirable or recognizable or relevant to those children, to those students, because people, I mean, I don't know if you have kids, even kids could tell when somebody's lying or trying to pull a fast one over them. So I'm part of the summer internship for Indigenous peoples in genomics, and I think it's unique in that we do delve into these ethical and legal issues and cultural issues as a part of their wet lab and their dry lab training. So they do get those skills, they get trained, but they get trained in an Indigenous context, in an Indigenous environment and atmosphere where people feel free to be angry, to cry, to point fingers. They can do whatever they want to get to where they need to get so that they can graduate with a PhD. And that has been successful. We've graduated a lot of PhDs in a number of disciplines. And so that's the answer to your first question. The answer to your second question of what to do about it, I think we need to somehow make the funding opportunities more agnostic, so there isn't that level of micromanagement from either federal funders or private funders, because they always have a goal in mind, but that goal has never been developed with an Indigenous group of scientists or politicians.
Yeah, Sing is a really powerful example of a successful Indigenous-driven project that has had a big consequence. I know lots of Sing graduates who are successful scientists. Do you think that's scalable? How do we continue to amplify that success?
Yeah, I think that is scalable. I can't remember if I mentioned it, but so the Native Biodata Consortium has been a co-applicant on several of these machine learning and AI grant mechanisms. And I hope we get it, because we are partnering with other underrepresented minorities like African Americans, the Canadian Black population, Latinos. We're trying to extend our network to populations that are like us, but also don't have any power because they don't have the sovereignty that tribes have in the United States or Canada.
Yeah, interesting. All right. Well, I think this has been really educational. I really appreciate your time. It's been, as always, a learning experience. And I really do appreciate you taking the time out of your day to do this for us.
I have a question for you.
Oh, please.
So yesterday I was doing a little bit of research about this idea of democratization of science. And I found a bunch of papers that were written using Blade Runner as an example, both from a capitalist perspective and a socialist perspective, and what democratization of science means. And it can mean a lot of different things. And I think it's key in defining what that means. And it's also key in creating, kind of like from maybe high school through graduate school, of what the responsibility of a scientist is to society. And I don't see those things as happening. I don't see many scientists with a well-rounded educational background to wield the power that they wield. And I just wanted to get your opinion on that.
I agree with you. I think that scientific, sometimes it's called STEM, scientific, technical, engineering, and mathematical education, has taken a funny turn in the last decade or two, where the emphasis has been really solely on the technical and scientific and whatever aspects, to the exclusion now of, there's, for many STEM education projects, there's no humanities or other kind of requirements in the curriculum. And I think that's been a devastating loss. I think that scientists are better scientists when they understand the human context of the work that they do. And it's a challenge in the current educational system, which is very, I'm going to call it returns oriented. How much money do you make if you major in this versus that? Drives a lot of students, potentially because a lot of students come out of school with enormous debt. It's all tied up in this kind of capitalism of education. And because of that, our ability to create well-rounded intellectuals that are not just technically skilled, but aware of the social and historic contexts in which their work is being done, really interferes with the quality of science, and certainly means that the impact that scientists have when they are powerful, which is not all that often, is reduced because of their sort of narrowness. And that's fairly new. It was not traditionally the case that scientists were so narrowly trained. And I think some of what we're trying to do locally, both in the training program that I direct and in the ISCB, is to broaden that, is to take, we can't change school curriculums, but the idea that the ethical aspects of, and the, as you called it, context is king aspects of doing science, I think there's a hope that that could improve. One place that might be an interesting driver for that is technology. So there was an editorial in Science and a piece in Nature recently looking at I won't call it the failure, but the inappropriateness of institutional review boards to look at AI and machine learning research. They don't individually affect the participants, right? There are few human participants, but unleashing these systems into the world has had big consequences socially, ethically, variety of ways. Reinscribing traditional biases as well as creating new problems. And the response is, gee, we got to do something about this. And there's this push for ESRs, ethical and social review boards, for AI and machine learning research and deployment. And I think that's a move in the right direction. It suggests that we have to think about the larger consequences of both our research and particularly the development and translation of that research into new medicine or new products. So I have some hope for it, but I agree with you that it's a challenge.
Yeah, and I think that needs to be extended to synthetic biology and genome editing as well. I've heard a lot of discussion about taking hardy, heat and drought-resistant plants from the equatorial regions and then editing those abilities into crops of northern Asia and North America, but there isn't much conversation about regulation in those regards either.
Yeah, that's a really interesting set of questions. So we are faced with, I'm going to call it catastrophic climate change, and our ability our foodways are threatened, among other things. And we're going to, in order to avoid, mass starvation events and other, disasters, we're really going to have to change our foodways. And I hope that scientific understanding of the crops and the environment that they're embedded in and the social systems that those are embedded in will help us change those ways. And I think that both genetic technology and indigenous knowledge are going to be important in changing those foodways. But mostly the drivers have been short-term profits, right? Roundup-resistant soybeans and salmon that grow fast have been the major GMO products, and that's not helping us address this catastrophe. So if we're going to be successful at that, I think we need to find ways to use the tools that we have, both ancient and modern, And I'm not sure how we're going to get there.
Yeah, and I think that was the theme of my talk is you, like me, probably got into the sciences when you were in primary school, and the draw was science fiction and these understandings of the world and nature, as well as being this great social equalizer. And I think that a lot of scientists and science generally has lost sight of those goals. The things that we love about science are not coming to fruition. We're basically, glorified mechanics in somebody else's garage.
Oh, that's pretty sad, Joe.
Yeah, yeah.
I had an experience yesterday where I was talking with the family of a child with rare disease that we had just made some interesting insights into and offered hope. I think there are places where we still have that, you know,
Yeah, but
vision.
look how small that example is.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, I'm only one guy,
Yeah.
but